Chile, September 12, 1973. A 16-year-old girl named Lelia Perez decided with 10 of her friends to go to the central square to protest against the newly formed government. Yet in the morning, before they ever had a chance of going to the central square, they were intercepted and taken by military forces. They were taken to a grand stadium where they were placed in the stands and their hands were tied. Soldiers were pointing machine guns at them and they were constantly being watched. You would quickly lose sense of time as the lights were constantly on. The only way we knew if it was day or night was by the food the guards were eating. While the detainees waited, the soldiers constructed special booths. In these booths, the detainees were tortured. They would teach them how to interrogate, how to apply the electricity, where and for how long. When they were torturing me, I went into my own world. It was as if I was looking down on myself, like it wasn't happening to me. It was brutal. Many of the detainees that entered these special booths and were tortured never came out. After 5 days, Lelia was randomly taken, they put her in a van and they randomly dropped her out in the streets with no explanation ever given. But this was only the beginning of her story. A couple years later, when she started studying at a university, she was once again arrested by Chilean forces. She was put into a car and driven 30 minutes outside of town to a place called Villa Grimaldi, a colonial home which had been turned into a center of detention and torture. They took us to an interrogation room where they had a metal bunk bed. There was another detainee on the top and my partner was tied to the side. They were interrogating all three of us at the same time, taking turns to electrocute us, one after the other. The interrogation session lasted through the night to the next morning. At Villa Grimaldi, detainees would be electrocuted, waterboarded, had their heads forced into buckets of urine and excrement, suffocated with bags, hanged by their feet or hands and beaten. Many women were raped, and for some detainees, punishment was death. When they were not being tortured, they were kept in dark, damp cells, where many of them believed it was the only world that existed. Lelia spent a year in Villa Grimaldi, being tortured and abused. After this, she was sent to a labor camp, where she had to work tirelessly for another 12 months before she was forced to leave the country in late 1976. Lelia's story is one of thousands of the survivors of Pinochet's hard military regime. Yet one of the theories that motivated Pinochet and his regime of shock and terror can be found in many other governments. Wherever this theory was applied, shock and terror followed, bringing harm to millions of people. This theory is the Shock Doctrine.
El centro de Santiago se está convirtiendo en un campo de batalla. Conmemoramos el nacimiento de nuestra libertad. Se recomienda a todos los habitantes el estricto acatamiento a las disposiciones directivas.
Lelia Perez's story is actually one that fits in a pattern of numerous survivors of one certain theory. More specifically, governments using a theory or using methods to be able to apply a certain theory. And this theory is the Shock Doctrine. It's perfectly explained in Naomi Klein's book of the same name. She goes into much more depth than I could ever do in one of these videos. So if you're interested in the topic, I definitely recommend checking out her book. So what exactly was the theory? The Shock Doctrine is entirely based on shock therapy, and it's especially based on the theories that were developed by professors, by psychiatrists such as Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron. If you don't know who he is, make sure to check out my previous video. In that video, I discussed Dr. Cameron's practices in much more depth. But long story short, Dr. Cameron was a psychiatrist who actually wanted to try and reset people's brains and then rebuild them into something more positive. So he started off by trying to reset people's brains. To do this, he used numerous practices such as electroshock therapy, the drug LSD, and sensory deprivation. And then once he was able to reset the brains of his patients, he then used a technique called psychic driving, which basically comes down to talking to them in their sleep. And using this method, he tried to rebuild their brain in a more positive setting. Now, his patients, many of them, most of them, if not all of them, did not give consent. But what's most important about Dr. Cameron's work is that it didn't work. None of his patients actually recovered and none of them showed positive signs when they left the institute. In fact, many of them left the institute in a much worse state than when they entered. Dr. Cameron worked at the McGill's Allen Memorial Institute in Canada. But the country which we'll be most talking about today is actually the USA, because the US, especially the CIA, was actually very interested in Dr. Cameron's research, so much so that the CIA even funded his research, although Dr. Cameron did not know of this. But the CIA wasn't interested in how Dr. Cameron tried to program the brains into something more positive. No, the CIA was more so interested in his techniques of how to reset the brain. The CIA actually used Dr. Cameron's research and the larger MKUltra project, in which the CIA attempted mind control using techniques such as Dr. Cameron's, but even worse techniques. The CIA used this to establish an interrogation manual. It was a manual designed for the US Army and even other armies on how to successfully interrogate prisoners. And in this manual, it was called the Kubark Manual, many of Dr. Cameron's methods were actually used. But more on that later in the video. For now, we will look at the theory of shock therapy. Namely, the idea that if you shock something to its core, you can reset it and then rebuild something on top of this. Because this theory was not only limited to people's minds. No, it was starting to be applied in many other fields as well. And one guy even took it to economics. And this man is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was an economics professor at the Chicago University, and his belief that you could shock the economy and then rebuild it, that was actually used by many governments, many of them military juntas or other not so democratic governments. But his theories were applied all over the world and led to some very disturbing results. Milton Friedman believed that this economic shock, shocking an entire economy and entire people, would actually allow societies to accept pure capitalism, to accept capitalism in a form that really meant that the state would not at all intervene, and even at some point the state would be demolished. And he believed that pure capitalism goes hand in hand with democracy. Which, when we look at the application of shock therapy, economic shock therapy, is actually something quite ironic, because it rarely ever was a democratic process. However, we will see more examples of that later as well. Milton Friedman was very much against the US New Deal and overall against any government involvement. He did not want the government to do anything when it came to economic level other than letting everything do its thing. He believed that if you shocked an economy to its core, it would reset to a natural state. And to achieve this state, the government should not at all intervene. It should not do anything. Naomi Klein describes his policy quite clearly as, if the government stops regulation, then the market will restore itself. And even Friedman himself admitted that his radical reforms rely on a state of shock and crisis, and he saw this as a tool for reform. And this belief that you can benefit from a crisis, whether it be a natural one or a political one, is also often termed disaster capitalism. So Friedman believed, or at least saw, social instability, no matter the cause, as an opportunity to push reforms which would normally require a lot of democratic process. Here you can already see the irony of calling pure capitalism democratic. But Friedman and his economic theory was actually one of the factors for economic reform in many military juntas. Now, let it be clear, it is one of the factors. I'm not saying that Milton Friedman was the only cause for Pinochet and other dictators to topple the country and submit its population to some terrible acts, but his theories and his beliefs and his advice even definitely was part of what motivated these people to do those things. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is it possible that Milton Friedman, a US professor, was so popular in the global south and even in the world in general? When it comes to South America, this was actually able and this was actually established by US involvement, because the USA actually funded South American students by giving them a scholarship to attend a US university to study there and then afterwards return to their own country. But what happened is that when these South American students went to the US, they were indoctrinated by US economic theories, which were mostly capitalist theories. It's no wonder that Friedman's Chicago school was actually a very popular destination for these students. And many of these students, when they returned back to the homeland, were given the name Chicago Boys, specifically for that reason, because they studied under Milton Friedman at the Chicago University and thus established a sort of Chicago School of Economics. And this was all part of the US ideological war against not just communism during the Cold War, but also against any form of nationalistic reforms. Because many of these enemies of the state, as the US would often term them, were not at all communist. They simply wanted what they believed what was best for their country, and this was oftentimes not even communism. It didn't even come close to it. But any form of nationalist reform was met with a lot of opposition, not necessarily just from the US government, but especially from US multinational companies. But more on that later. Let's first look at an example of these economic reforms being implemented. And for this, we'll go back to Lilia Perez, because Lilia Perez fell victim to Pinochet's military regime. Now, who exactly was this General Pinochet? Chile was actually one of the first nationalistic countries, in the sense that they wanted to nationalize many of their industries. And the person who wanted to do this was democratically elected president, self-proclaimed socialist president Salvador Allende. Now, already during the elections, the US, through the CIA, tried to intervene. They tried any means possible to prevent Allende from being elected and from being able to get in a position to implement his reforms. However, despite this intervention, Allende still won with a vast majority. Many of the people in Chile believed that nationalizing their industries would lead to positive results, and therefore they elected Allende. However, Allende's policy of nationalization, of course, went against the interests of many multinational US companies, one of which was ITT. And it's very interesting because ITT owned the majority of Chile's mobile telephone industry, but when Allende was elected, ITT used a lot of funds to lobby the US government into doing something about it. There's many reports of ITT communicating with US diplomats, with people in contact with the US government to do anything that's necessary to prevent the Chilean mobile telephone industry from becoming nationalized. And they succeeded. Now, you might be asking, why would a US-based company invest so much money in toppling a foreign government simply for their own interest? Surely a company would not do that. I mean, they have plenty of business in the US. Well, that's where you're wrong. Sadly, there's many companies which actually have done this, and when you look at the US involvement, but also other countries' involvement in foreign affairs, many of these were motivated by the interests of companies, which is enough information for a whole new video, really. But back to Chile. So the US government was lobbied by many of these companies to attempt to get rid of Allende, and the US government heavily applied the CIA in doing this. Because President Nixon, who was president of the US at the time, actually funded the Chilean military to stage a coup. Now, this coup was led by General Pinochet. And what followed when the coup actually happened was Pinochet's reign of shock. The very instant that Pinochet attempted his coup, he already planned to shock the population. And this is visible in how he did the coup. I mean, he used the Chilean military to bomb the Chilean parliament. The parliament couldn't even do anything. So bombing it was purely for shocking the local population, for making it clear that they were not kidding around. They bombed the parliament, they murdered Allende, and they publicly released pictures of his corpse, all to shock the local population. Now, when the military coup was finished and when the new military junta led by General Pinochet was established, many of his economic advisors were these South American students who went to study at US University, more specifically at the Chicago University. All of Pinochet's economic advisors studied under Milton Friedman, and they were often termed the Chicago Boys. Now, these reforms from the Chicago Boys were eventually also implemented by Pinochet. Pinochet used a massive amount of violence among his own population in order to establish these reforms, but also in order to prevent any uprising. He repressed any opposition to his rule, and he did this in some very extreme ways, even internationally. For example, the former ambassador for Chile under Allende's rule was actually bombed in the US because he did not support Pinochet's rule. And once again, this bombing was also heavily helped by the CIA. But Pinochet actually put the blame for all of his issues on the left. Whether they be socialist, whether they be communist, it really doesn't matter. If you're left, you're the problem. And he used this as a motivation to lock up anyone even remotely favoring leftists' ideologies. He would lock these people, like Lilia Perez, he would lock them up in stadiums, and there he would torture them, some of them to their death, all to just shock the population. And actually, when the FIFA Football World Cup was held in that year, it was actually held in Chile. And in one of these stadiums, which held hostages previously, FIFA allowed Chile to play a match in that stadium, despite many of the reports of what Chile was actually doing previously in that stadium. Now, what about international response? Well, Pinochet's so-called movement towards capitalism initially was actually praised by Milton Friedman. He even visited Pinochet, what he himself called advising as a doctor, advising a patient some medicine. Yet later he actually claimed, or at least attempted to claim, no affiliation whatsoever with the Chilean government. Interesting approach, to say the least, but luckily he did not mislead everyone, because when he later received the Nobel Prize for Economics, God knows for what reason, he was actually met with a lot of disruption during his ceremony, which seems to have hurt him quite a bit. But Friedman's reforms in Chile, more importantly, didn't work. You can already see a pattern here, including shock therapy. But it didn't work. I mean, his reforms led to skyrocketing inflation, at some point even 375%. And when met with this, Friedman's advice to Pinochet was simply to do more. He literally looked at this and said the problem was not enough. He said that Pinochet should take it even further. And in many ways, Pinochet did. Many of the economic reforms that Pinochet executed was privatization of, up until then, still nationalized Chilean industries. Many of these industries were then bought by, you guess it, US companies. He also got rid of any form of price regulation, whether they be on bread or eggs, it didn't matter, they were gone. And overall, he just cut government expenditure and removed any import barriers. In short, he removed as much government intervention into economic affairs as possible. Exactly what Friedman advised. Now, these reforms mainly benefited the wealthy. The large population of Chile actually started living in poverty under Pinochet's rule. It led to high unemployment and high homelessness. And in fact, an average Chilean during this time would need up to 70% of his wage just to get food. They would need to spend more than 70% of their wage just to get food. I mean, can you imagine? And then Friedman steps in and says, what you're doing wrong is you're not doing enough. It's honestly insane to me, but what's even worse is that Chile is not at all an exception. Chile was the norm. We can look at Chile's neighbor, Argentina. They suffered a very similar fate under their military junta, because they also had a military coup against a socialist, democratically elected socialist government. And once again, this coup was US backed, and once the coup was established, once the military rule was established, it were once again US funded scholars who were in charge of economic reform. And within a year, it led to, you guess it, high inflation, high unemployment, privatization of state companies, and high poverty among the average population. Just like their neighbor, Chile. But they honestly saw what was happening in Chile and they thought, that's a really good idea. I mean, it's beyond me what their thought process was. I mean, it was not at all thinking of the people, that's clear. Because in Chile, they already had seen that these reforms were not at all favorable to the general population, and they did not lead to some very favorable results for the ruling class either. But still, the military junta in Argentina as well used shock and fear in order to push their reforms and oppress their population. The Argentinian military would actually abduct people in broad daylight to cause fear among the population. They did not at all hide what they were doing. They would drop bodies, dead bodies, in the streets, in the sea, And these people would just wash up on shore and everybody would know what had happened to them. And this caused huge fear among the population for both expressing any form of leftist ideology, but more so for the military rule. Argentina took it even further. They murdered pregnant women in order to create orphans. And these orphans would remind everybody in their neighborhood of what happens when you speak up against Argentinian rule, but more so what happens if you share any positive regard to leftist ideology. And essentially what this junta attempted was to re-engineer an entire country into opposing any form of leftist ideology, and especially Marxism. They used this extreme shock to really implement the idea in a population that any leftist ideology is met with some very drastic consequences and thus should be avoided. And afterwards, when this military junta was arrested, a lot of this shock remained. So both Chile and Argentina and many other countries as well used extreme torture methods to subdue their own population. And these methods are actually also inspired in many ways by Dr. Cameron's research, because these methods can be found in the Kubark interrogation manual. The manual that I was talking about earlier that was established by the CIA, which had a whole list on how to interrogate terrorists or prisoners and extract any information from them. Some of the methods that were talked about in this manual were those established by Dr. Cameron. So electroshock therapy, the usage of narcotics, especially LSD, and sensory deprivation and sensory overload. The entire manual is available on the internet if you want to read it, but both the Chilean and Argentina armies were actually taught this manual, and they were taught these torture techniques by a US-funded School of America, which was entirely designed by the CIA. Now, the teachers at the School of Americas, they mainly taught South American police or military on how to extract information from soldiers, terrorists, and prisoners. They did not teach them to explicitly use it on opposition, on civilians, but this was how it was used by the armies. These methods in Chile and Argentina and other countries as well showed that there was no such thing as freedom in brutal, pure disaster capitalism. They relied a lot on shock and terror and torture even, and it's safe to say that it was quite unpopular among the population, because the population was the one that was suffering for it. The crazy thing is that while the US was doing this internationally and was intervening in foreign countries, President Nixon at home did the exact opposite. When the US faced high inflation, high unemployment, and high homelessness, Nixon actually decided to do the other thing. He decided to go for a more leftist approach and apply some more Keynesian policies. Keynesian policies are a lot different from socialist policies, but it's definitely not pure capitalist policies as were described by Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman actually opposed Nixon's decision, but Nixon's decision to apply Keynesian policies actually helped Nixon secure his re-election and were very popular among the population because they actually helped the population. However, despite of this, Milton Friedman still believed it to be a bad thing and was very angered by the US government deciding not to follow his advice. But South America is not the only example of the shock doctrine being implemented. In fact, there are many different examples in Asia, in Europe, in North America. These theories led to some very similar results in all of these countries. It led to millions and millions of people suffering terrible conditions, maybe not as terrible as the torture conditions in Chile and Argentina, but nonetheless, millions of people all over the world suffered this shock doctrine. But I'll talk more about these other countries in the next video. For now, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe not the content, but I thought it was important to share this, seeing how it's all freely available. If you're interested in the topic and if you want to get some more information about it, I definitely recommend checking out the book. It's quite dense and it has a lot of facts concerning these situations. But for now, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.